Hello, the Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files, and we are bringing back the Speaker Series, where we speak to important people that influence Canadian foreign policy or are, in general, Canadians doing good work across the world on foreign policy. And our guest is no other than Daniel Dumbrill, a Canadian and entrepreneur who came to China in 2008 and has, in the coming years, especially since events in Hong Kong SAR kicked off in 2019, has really had a loud and strong political voice on the situation around China and the demonization of this crucial nation in the world. So, Mr. Dumbrill, thank you for taking the time to speak with the Canada Files.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a while, so it's good to speak to you again.
It certainly is. Now, moving to China was the trigger for a big change in your life's trajectory. What were you hoping to achieve in life before considering a move to China?
During that time, I wasn't really involved in geopolitics at all. And I was just kind of looking for something different. I had a business that I was running in Canada. Uh, Most of the product I was supplying was coming from China. And so I moved to be closer to the source. But to be honest, I could have still run it from Canada, but I was just looking for a change at that point. So it was as simple as that in the beginning.
Now, can you talk about the series of events that led you to be willing to move to China in 2008?
I guess that would just be more personality based. I didn't really have any strong opinions one way or another of China. I did visit once or twice for a trade show in Hong Kong. I came across to Shenzhen and in mainland China, just across the border from Hong Kong, and I just thought it was a cool place. I just thought this is cool. This is different. Definitely a lot more going on. And I said, you know what? I'm going to move here. I was in a position in my life where I was able to do that. And so I just jumped at it. I thought it would be an interesting adventure.
Now, I want to ask because you were coming to China in a time when there was a lot more Western friendliness to China. They thought it was just going to be a cheap China. They thought they could just exploit the country and, the West could have its top place, right, in the world. So I'm wondering what your perceptions of China, politically and the situation in the country, was before you made the jump to come and live in China.
I think at that time, you're right. The propaganda against China wasn't as bad. It still did exist. I do remember making a video in 2006, 2007 timeframe. I think that was probably one of the first videos that I ever made. I don't even know where I uploaded it to, but I was talking about how a story didn't make sense when they were blaming China for something. I think it had to do with some sort of imported goods that were tainted or something along the lines of that. So I I think I was open to the idea that what we were being told in the West was wrong, but sadly, I probably believed most of the stuff that was being said about China. The propaganda wasn't as bad, but generally what they said about the government and this kind of stuff, I just felt like it's probably true. So I wouldn't say I had an overly positive opinion or an overly negative opinion. I just thought it was a cool place, and I thought I would come and try a new adventure, basically.
Thank you. Now, I'm wondering about the early days of your new life in China. How were you able to adapt, and what cultural differences back then really caught you off guard?
I didn't really have any major challenges. I mean, I come from a mixed ethnic background to begin with. My father's British, my mother's from South America, and I had a lot of friends from all over the world, from Cambodia and so many other places growing up. So I was okay with getting along with people who just thought differently from me. I was open minded to, if I had certain encounters that maybe would be perhaps a little bit surprising or even off putting to other people, I would say, well, you know what, maybe there's some sort of a misunderstanding here, or oh, this is interesting. Things are done differently here. So there's nothing really that stood out. And I think one of the things that probably helps, though, is that China and the people in China are so welcoming to people who come to China. They're so welcoming to foreigners. It's a very different experience from, visible minorities or people coming from other countries going to the West that they often have. Almost the complete opposite. Even to the point where I think some people were even taking advantage of it because they came here and they would roll out the red carpet for people. And there were some people that were taking advantage of that. That kind of made me upset when I saw stuff like that. But going back to the original point, because everybody was so welcoming here, there was nothing really that stood out for me that said, oh, this is really difficult.
So during the 2010s, you had many experiences, I'm quite sure, before really life-changing events began to occur, those riots in the Hong Kong SAR in 2019. So throughout your life, and whether it's on the political or more likely on the personal side, what achievements were you most proud of during that decade?
Well, I mean, that's when I started my family in a bigger way. I've got 5 kids now, so that definitely would be at the forefront. But in terms of the geopolitical side, speaking up in terms of what was happening in Hong Kong and how disconnected it was from what Western media was saying. The thing that I wasn't expecting anything out of that. It was outrageous to me how much context was left out. But still, the thing that made me the most proud about that was I had people from Hong Kong. My eldest son was going to school in Hong Kong, and we had already moved back to mainland China. But some of his old classmates' parents reached out to me, Hong Kongers, born and raised, and they thanked me for speaking up for them. And they said that they couldn't say anything. They really wanted to say something, but they couldn't say anything because they were still living in Hong Kong. And if they said something, the rioters would have found them because the rioters were really violent to other Hong Kongers who just disagreed with them. I mean, they literally lit a man on fire simply for asking people to stop destroying one of the MTR stations. It was extremely violent. But to have those people reach out to me, I mean, especially when on the mainstream side and based on what's being boosted and based on what's being hidden, you can imagine the amount of hate you get when you do stand out against the mainstream. So to have these people quietly reach out in the background and saying the environment doesn't exist for me to be able to do what you're doing, to say what you're saying, especially considering where I am, and thank you for doing this on our behalf. I think that made me feel really proud, and it felt like I was doing something of value.
Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the early times of the riots. So, what really, drove you to speak out in that kind of way? Because I know you talked about the responses you got afterwards, but what really was a concern for the future? Your family, what kind of place you could raise them in? What really drove you to stick your neck out in quite a public way?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing was just how outrageous it was. It was just unbelievable to know firsthand, to have been going on the ground in Hong Kong and seeing what Western media was saying. And I thought, you can't. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with this. And it made me also think back to my mother's country of Guyana. When they were electing their first prime minister, Chetty Jagan, he was a little bit too friendly with the Soviet Union back then. So in the 60s, the US and the British went in and instigated riots between the people of African and Indian descent. And they started killing each other. My grandmother was telling me about that period of time too and how scary it was. And it felt like when I was looking at how things were being instigated and how things were being reported on the ground in Hong Kong, I felt like I was getting a view or a picture into some of the mechanisms that might have been at play in order to make that possible in Guyana. And now that social media exists, and now that we have a platform to speak directly to people in such a way that didn't exist in the 60s, I felt like it would be such a waste. And it's actually even imperative that if you have the chance to reach some people and you have this platform and you can see in front of your face the lies that are being told, then you should speak out. You should use that opportunity. So maybe that's what it came down to for me.
Right. Now, in terms of the intimidation, I was watching some of your earlier videos in the very early years of your channel, and I remember one where I believe it was a man you spoke to, you interviewed him outside of the Chungking mansions, and I just remember the fear, and I remember that he was talking about that, and it really it was an us against them mentality that I you could see so clearly from the rioters. And believe me, I've watched and I've seen the footage of people being assaulted and attacked. And one of the things I noticed as a trend was when they're beating people and attacking people, they would put an umbrella over them so you couldn't see them as well. And you talk about the umbrella revolution and all this nonsense. The umbrellas were not a tool of progress. They ended up being a tool of attempts to degenerate the entire society. So it's just a whole mess. It was a whole mess truly there. But the riots were eventually neutered, in part thanks to the implementation of the national security law in 2020. But I want to ask really, what price did you and other ordinary folks in Hong Kong pay for opposing the rioters?
Well, I mean, because I live in China, I the impact is probably less. Later on with the CBC, that might have had greater implications for me, which we can get into later on. But during that period of time, I was okay. But I could see that had I been in Canada and I had been speaking out, it probably would have cost me a lot more. It would probably would have cost me, if I was not running my own business, job opportunities, the fact that I was running my business opportunities, and um, all kinds of other penalties for speaking out. It's amazing how it works, how people are. I mean, you can see the same thing happening with people who simply say something like, they don't think Palestinian children should be killed, like that famous YouTuber, I can't remember her name right now, but she simply hosted a Palestinian child, an amputee, and she was labeled an anti-Semite, and everybody's trying to cancel her. And so that's an even more extreme example of how these mechanisms work in Western society to keep people in line and to realize that speaking out against the mainstream narratives just come with too many risks. But luckily for me, based on where I was at that point in time, it was really limited. Other than receiving kind of hate from people who wanted to preserve mainstream narratives, it was pretty minimal.
All right, fair enough. Now, as the protests weakened in the HKSAR, you really spoke up in opposition to the West's demonization of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. You actually even spoke on a 2021 Canadian panel about after the Xinjiang genocide vote farce in Canada's parliament around that demonization. So, how do you feel when you look back at the role, whatever big or small you feel it is, in opposing this demonization at its peak, which attracted the praise of the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the sleazy attacks of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that is Canada's national broadcaster?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just something that needs to be done. Again, just so disconnected from reality. And at that time, also, I felt like China is pretty remarkable in the sense that it has reached such a massive economic scale, um, superpower status, without subjugating the rest of the world. And there's people who try to make these stories of how China's subjugating the world, but it requires a lot of creativity to produce a story that is pretty weak to begin with. Um, and I was afraid that this kind of propaganda about the people in Xinjiang had the potential to actually hold China back and to actually stop this, move into a multipolar world that we were getting into. And furthermore, the people being affected the most by these lies were actually the people they were pretending to care about, Uyghur people, where they were being fired from jobs because even just seeing an image of a Uyghur working in a factory was enough to say slave labor, as if there's no Uyghurs who ever wanted to voluntarily work. And I mean, that's the same case all over the world. If you look at the various philosophies around how sanctions work and how these kinds of things work, where the US tries to create a discontent population, take away their economic opportunities to the point where they become discontent and rise up against their own governments. So I think for those two reasons, one, that I felt like Western propaganda against China was actually going to work and was going to actually prevent us moving into this multipolar world, and the fact that it was affecting ordinary people on the ground in Xinjiang, I felt like that was, again, just something that was really important to do. When the Chinese Foreign Ministry shared my video, I didn't know until after it went out, and somebody had sent it to me. They said, "Dude, your video was played at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs." I was like, "What?" And then, of course, the CBC came after me after that, and that was I mean, that was an extremely valuable experience. I was so lucky that I recorded the whole thing so I could show people firsthand how mainstream media works, how they cut something that I said, out of a whatever, a 30-minute interview where I was so careful to say things in such a way that they wouldn't be able to take just a snippet and cut me out of context. Yet they still managed to do that. However, they were forced to only use a 3.5-second clip to make it sound like I said something that I did not say at all. And so I think I'm glad it happened. I'm glad it happened because I got to show people firsthand now, not just from talking about other cases and not just saying, I think this is what happened. Now I can actually tell people, I can show you exactly how this works because I have the full recording and I can show you exactly what these kinds of news outlets do to lie and to try to convince you of something that is totally false.
All right, so the CBC now obviously is a pretty big national institution in Canada. So, what was your impression of CBC before this interview, and really how did it get shaped by the conduct of the journalists, or we can call them stenographers, at that outlet around this Xinjiang tomatoes story?
You see, the CBC it was something I always imagined they had their own bias, their own uh, agenda, but I never thought it was as bad as, for example, U.S. media. And because the CBC is such a big organization, um, I looked back on the CBC fondly because when I was, you know, driving around in my car, I would usually listen to different CBC programs and podcasts, even though you didn't call them podcasts back then, or entertainment like the Vinyl Cafe with Stuart McLean, and they've got some great programming. I just didn't think too much about their mainstream media arm, but I probably thought that yeah, they've got the same problems that other places have. I didn't realize the extent of it until they did their hit piece on me, though.
Fair enough. Now, you actually went quiet for most of 2023. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering what prompted this? What kind of reflections did you have during this time? And what drove your eventual return to consistent content creation?
Well, going back to what I said, that I was worried in the beginning that the propaganda against China would actually work. I'm not afraid of that anymore. I don't. I think it's too late. I think the mask has fallen. I think it's obvious to everyone that these countries that are, pretending to stand for certain things don't. I think the narrative on the Uyghur genocide has fallen apart now that people can see what an actual real genocide looks like. And I'm not worried that foreign propaganda is going to work anymore. I did sometimes kind of fight back against individual YouTubers also who would put out really garbage takes on China or deliberately maliciously false. But I've kind of come to appreciate them too, because these are the kinds of YouTubers and these are the kinds of people who are constantly telling everybody that China's government is a failure. China is falling apart. It's never going to amount to anything. They're hiding the truth from you, that they're a failing society. I'm actually kind of thankful to them now because had they not, people like them also, whether it be in mainstream media or other YouTubers, had they not been busy trying to convince everybody that China is nothing to worry about, and it still isn't something to worry about, but let me quantify that, that they cannot amount to anything. When people actually saw that China was peacefully rising and was accomplishing so much, I think there would have been more effort to hold China down. I think if people were convinced that China is the next superpower and they're doing this without subjugating the rest of the world like anybody else did, and they're going to take away our ability to continue to subjugate the rest of the world because they are a very highly successful society. Again, I think more would have been done to hold China down. But instead, you had all of these useful idiots who were useful in a way that they didn't intend to be, which was convincing everybody that, well, you know what, we don't need to pay attention to China. They're never going to amount to anything because this guy on YouTube told me that they're a failed society. You know what I mean? So
Now,
to go back to the original point, because of all these things, because I'm not worried about it anymore, because I'm actually appreciative of the work that these other people do, to keep China off the radar in the sense that nobody's going to feel like they have to squash them. I felt like that I didn't really need to do much anymore.
Very interesting. Okay. Now, you had talked about the overall, and the political views of China overall had grown much more positive. Now, that's interesting. Do you, since, let's say, especially Trump's annexationist threats towards Canada this year, have Canadians really reached out to you, or have you seen, in your opinion, Canadians become more open to China? And if yes, do you think that's more purely economic side, or do you think there's beginning to be more of a grasp that on the quote unquote, Western human rights standards, that even by those standards, actually China hits them and flies by them?
I think sometimes, I mean, obviously, what's happening is a wake up call. I think that Canada really needed to be pushed into diversifying a bit. They rely on the US too much. And so I'm really, again, also grateful for what Trump is doing and grateful for what the US is doing, because no matter what, it was just too risky to rely on one partner that much. And now that you can see how quickly the tide can change with that one partner, it makes sense that Canadians and Canadian politicians would want to diversify and would want to perhaps reevaluate their relationship with China, which is and has mostly been demonized by the US and also discouraged by the US. Whether that actually happens or not, I'm not sure, because sometimes what the obvious outcome should be when you see warning signs like this doesn't always come to fruition. From speaking to my friends in Canada, I did get the sense that they were, a little bit more open minded about it. Like, a few years ago, if my parents would come and visit me in China, their, neighbors would say to them, "Oh, is that safe? Is that a good idea to go to China?" And they were, really worried about that. And to which my parents, because they've been many times, would say, "I think you should be worrying about us if we were going to certain places in the US, but not China." I don't think you get that as much anymore. So anecdotally, I think it is changing, and maybe that's also wishful thinking though. But it makes sense that there would be a shift now.
Well, let's see if that translates into too much meaningful. There's the folks over at Canadians United Against Modern Exclusion that just launched against McCarthyism in Canada, and they've certainly been tuning the horn very loudly about the dangers of there's a foreign influence transparency registry and the pressures it's putting on the Chinese Canadian community. So let's see if the community is able to really raise their voices at a time that Canadians might be more open to it. But we'll really have to see what happens going
Right.
forward
Yeah,
there,
we'll have to wait and see.
for sure. Now, you've firmly kept your independence while defending China from demonization. How have you done this, and have there been any missed opportunities as a result?
I think I mean, I was never doing it in such a way to look for opportunities. It I think the only way I can, well, there's a couple ways. If it cost me opportunities, it would just be in terms of me taking focus away from my business and putting more focus on growing my business, or getting into more new kind of areas here. So, from a time commitment point of view, perhaps the one thing I haven't mentioned also on my channel, was that after the CBC documentary, or sorry, not documentary, news report aired, I had complained to their ombudsman and I showed them the full video, and they couldn't help but admit. I mean, it was right there in front of them. They said, "Yeah, we're sorry. We'll put a small note, a corrections note on our corrections page, and we will make sure that anywhere this video is published in the future, it will be accompanied by a correction note." And that they didn't do that. It ended up showing up on a website in New Zealand called News NZ Stuff or something like that, a news outlet there. And they had bought it through a news aggregate, because the CBC, I think, sells their clips through a news aggregate, and other news stations around the world can pick it up. Got published on there with no correction note, as the ombudsman had promised. Within a few months of that airing, I lost my two biggest clients in Canada. I lost my two biggest clients in Canada for a product that I was exporting. I can't 100% connect it to that, but I had a relationship with some of them for over a decade. And they, one of them in particular, went to a new supplier without asking for a new quote or anything like that. The relationship was always good. I built systems that they used, which they were really happy with. So I would imagine, even though I can't say 100%, that that was also a cost. That probably would have been the greatest cost.
Now, while fighting demonization of China, you have still sought to enjoy life, as really anybody should. So, since COVID zero ended in China, where have you traveled and what spots do you feel were most memorable?
Yeah, I mean, we have an RV and we take road. I took my parents on a road trip up through Gansu, Qinghai, through the Tibetan areas, through the Hui Muslim areas. I think that was probably one of the most memorable trips, in part because of the scenery and the people we met along the way, and also in part just because it was a great trip with family. You know, camping out at different places, lighting campfires and roasting marshmallows, and just what kind of a very typical Canadian kind of experience, but with China as the backdrop. It's trips like that that are probably the most memorable for me.
Now, a bit more of a personal question, with raising kids, how have you balanced really the traveling for work, traveling for content, and having some personal travel, having some time, as you mentioned, with family and so forth in these years?
Well, I mean, that's, as you said, I didn't make too many videos later on, so that's more time with my family. But even when I did make videos, I mean, my family's my number one priority. So we always, on weekends, we go on little trips, or when the kids are, have a holiday. Um, that balance was never really an issue. Kids have a lot of homework here in China also, I think more so than in the West. So a lot of their time is focused on that. But when they do get free time, yeah, we're always doing something.
Fair enough. Now, you already talked about the potential op risks and so forth in Canada if you were hypothetically there around the time of the riots in Hong Kong SAR. But, the paranoia has really rose sharply in 2022. You can thank people like Robert Fife, Sam Cooper, et cetera, and these CSIS leakers, quote unquote. Now, after this kicked off and you have the push towards an inquiry in Canada, you have the final report and all that jazz. Do you think since 2022, if you were in Canada still somehow by that point, would it have been feasible for you to keep producing this content in the way that you have in combating this demonization while you have the big reach that you do?
I think if I was in Canada, regardless if it was pre 2022 or post 2022, I think while trying to operate in the Canadian marketplace and while trying to grow a business there, I think it would have been difficult, not impossible. But if I'm relying on building relationships with partners or whatever it is, clients, I think there would have always been a risk there. And if I were in Canada, though, I'd probably be a little bit more disconnected from what was really actually going on in China. And so I may have not been as qualified to speak as the way I do now. So it would have been just a totally different dynamic altogether.
So, with the Americans really repeatedly shooting themselves in the foot and completely, destroying their world opinion among, let's say, the more liberal-minded parts of the populations around the world, where do you think the future is heading in China? When your kids are, I don't know, 30 or 40, what kind of nation do you think they're going to be existing in by that point?
I think it's going to be one that's more globally connected. I think with everything that's unfolding in the world, there are more countries that are looking to partner with China. The U.S. and certain Western countries stand alone with their stance on places like Israel. Uh, Other places are realizing that they don't actually have shared values of humanity with the West, and or with a lot of Western countries rather. And so I think we're going to see a far more interconnected China. China's, of course, going to have its own challenges. They were in a bit of an economic downturn for a while. They'll have their own challenges to overcome, and anything could really happen. But the one thing that I think is certain is that it will be a far more interconnected China. And I think that if you've got experience with China, if you speak Chinese, I think, for my kids growing up, I think it's going to bring a lot of future opportunities for them, because there's just so many exciting things happening here. And whether they continue to live and work in China or they go overseas to another country, again, it will just become more interconnected with China. So I'm quite positive about China's future in that sense.
Appreciate that insight. Now, looking towards the future, I believe the Canada Files audience would be very fascinated to know what are your ambitions for your YouTube channel in the coming years, and what purpose do you hope the channel can serve?
I think I just want to have fun with it at this point. I just filmed a video at the world's highest bridge, which is about to open at the end of the month. I also flew out to, or not flew out, rather, took a high speed train out to Chengdu. And one of my really closest friends here, who I've known for about a decade in China, he's a Tibetan guy. I went to his wedding a few months back and we connected, and he took me on a tour around the Tibetan areas in Chengdu. And it was just so much fun. We were having drinks, we were eating yak meat. So I think that stuff is fun to me. And also, I think people are a little bit more open minded to see stuff like that now. Before, if you did that, people would be like, "Oh, this is propaganda." Whereas now, it's like, let me see what's actually going into China, on in China, now that they don't have such a negative opinion about it. Occasionally, things come up more political that I still would like to use my platform for. For example, Dan Duggan in Australia is being persecuted by his government and handed over to the US. It's a really, really outrageous case. So I was happy to get on a call with Robbie Barwick from the Australian Citizens Party to bring that to people's attention. On my X, formerly known as Twitter, I have not as big of a following as on YouTube, but I don't have as much to say on there. However, I do use it as a platform to boost what's going on in Palestine, because I think it's so outrageous what's happening there. And if you have a platform and you're not talking about it, you're not letting people know what's happening, I think that would be kind of a moral failure. And with that said too, it's really interesting to see other people who are pretending to care about human rights and manufacturing all of these stories in China, like you were talking about in Xinjiang, a supposed genocide that requires the use of your imagination. But once you see one actually happening in front of your eyes, being televised live with graphic images, all of a sudden these people are silent. So many of these people are silent. So that's it, going a little bit off on a side tangent, but those are the two values I have. For the Twitter, it seems a little bit more appropriate, and it makes me a little bit more able to share and boost some of those stories. And then on the YouTube side, basically just have a little bit of fun and show people the real China.
All right, now I want to clarify for the audience that the Canada spoke to Daniel Dumbrill because he actually took his family to Canada for the first time in 7 years. But I want to clarify to the audience that he has a video up, a rather excellent one, and that already really takes us through everything about that trip and all your feelings there. So I think simply feel that editorially, I think I don't want to waste Mr. Dumbrill's time here about that. But now, uh, how can people keep an eye on your work? You mentioned Twitter, you mentioned YouTube. Are there any other platforms that you are on?
That's really it. I do a little bit of content on Chinese social media, like on Red Note, but that's more, like for example, I opened up a gym here in Chongqing. And so I posted some updates about that. That's more kind of smaller daily life stuff. But for the most part, the bulk of my content goes onto YouTube under my name, Daniel Dumbrill, and also on Twitter under the same handle.
Well, Mr. Dumbrill, thank you very much for speaking to the Canada Files. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
And to the Camp Files audience, if you appreciate this journalism, please do consider setting up a monthly or annual donation to support this work. I will see you all for the next interview. Goodbye.